Thank you all very much for coming and welcome here. I'm Julian Huppert and I run the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. For those of you who don't know Jesus College, it's a very old institution. It was originally a nunnery in the 1100s. It's been a college since 1496. So we have a very long tradition of study, of scholarship. We also do new things. You may notice this was not built in 1496 where we are now. In fact, we only opened this a few months earlier. And the Intellectual Forum, which sits here, is aimed at trying to bring people together to think and to talk and to make a difference. And tonight is one of the events that we do to try to get people talking, to get people thinking. And we will look at any sort of issue, almost no matter what. Let me take this week as an example. We've had a two-day conference on education with Charles Chen Yidan of the Yidan Prize, the world's biggest prize in education. We had Professor Lee last night, an engineer, talking about the engineering, the building of One Belt, One Road. We obviously have tonight's fantastic talk that you're all here for. And then tomorrow night, we have Professor Jimmy Chu, who is wonderful to have here as well, talking about the more fashionable elements. You may notice I'm more fashionable below the ankle than above, and that is thanks to Jimmy. There are then other things going on. We have the John Hughes Arts Festival for the weekend. So we are interested in anything and everything. So thank you very much for coming. We hope to see you at further events. And it's fantastic to have the master of the college, whose vision all of this has been, who will introduce our very special guest tonight, Ian.
Mr. Chu, it's a true honour for us that you are here, and we look forward to hearing from you so much tomorrow night. And of course, it is also the greatest honour to welcome Dr Danilo Turk, Slovenian diplomat, professor of international law, human rights expert, and major political figure who served as President of Slovenia from 2007 to 2012. He, of course, before then had a substantial relationship with the United Nations, having been the first ambassador there on behalf of Slovenia, and then later being Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. He, of course, is very much at home in academia, having visiting positions at Columbia, at Remnen, and Ljubljana. And despite those many commitments, he has done so much for the greater good. A foundation in his name devoted rehabilitation of child victims of armed conflict, being chairman of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace, and chairman on the board of the Global Fairness Initiative, a Washington-based NGO dedicated to economic and social development in developing nations. He will, of course, tonight be speaking on a topic which is right at the heart of development, and which, if some are to be believed, and I have great sympathy with that, is arguably the greatest development activity that might happen this century, a century which some are already calling the Asian century. Your perspective from that and a European and global aspect will be fascinating, and we look forward very much to hearing everything that you're about to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice and generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this prestigious university. It's a great honor to speak here at Cambridge, and especially Cambridge is a place of great surprises, some of which we have witnessed earlier today. I'd like to thank Professor Chu for the surprise he presented us with earlier this afternoon. And also I'd like to say that I was surprised when I saw the name of the hall, which is named after Peter Frankopan, a descendant of Croatia, a neighboring country of Slovenia, nobility from Croatia, currently historian, first in Cambridge, now I understand he's teaching at Oxford, and a very prominent writer about China and about the future of the world seen from the perspective of growth of Asia as a critically important part of the world. So there are many symbolic features characterizing my presence here and the topic that I'm expected to address. And I have to start with an emphasis on modesty. Of course, I am not a China specialist. I'm not a sinologist. I'm not a historian. I'm not an economist. There are many things that I'm not. But I have followed the developments relating to China and worked with a number of Chinese friends, also meeting Chinese presidents, starting with President Jiang Zemin, when I was traveling with Kofi Annan to China fairly regularly, later President Hu Jintao, and now most recently with President Xi Jinping, whom I had the honor to meet in November last year and discuss some of the most interesting subjects arising from the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China and his historic speech. So I believe that this experience created a sufficient amount of curiousness, inquisitive spirit that entitles me to put before you some ideas more in form of hypotheses than in form of any proposed firm conclusions. But obviously, these hypotheses are a result of thought and reflection, partly, as I said, as a result of my previous work, partly as my current work. I'm traveling to China fairly often. I'm currently a visiting fellow of the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies, which is an institute essentially consisting of young researchers who are looking at various aspects of Belt and Road Initiative from the point of view of economic experience, but also from the point of view of political dimensions of that very important project, which I agree will be probably the most ambitious, the most transformative development project of this century. Therefore, there are many reasons why in an intellectual environment such as Cambridge, it is useful to lay out certain hypothetical ideas and then, of course, discuss them further. And I'm sure that this hall will see many speakers who will speak about the subject, very probably with much better knowledge than mine and with better and more studied conclusions than the ones that I can offer. But I would like to say, by way of hypothesis, a few fairly basic things. First, the world has learned in the last 30 years or so that the development of China is critical for the development of the whole world. We who have worked in the United Nations following the year 2000, when the Millennium Development Goals were proclaimed, we were interacting with China practically from the very start. And I remember a conversation that Kofi Annan had with Li Peng, at that time Prime Minister, who said, well, Secretary General, you will see China will fulfill the Millennium Development Goals and that will help the world. Now, that was in the year 2000 and we didn't know how things would go. Of course, later on we realized that not only did this happen, but it happened in a steady way. Every 5-year plan in China was implemented, and that has created something which I believe to be very important today, and that is the high level of credibility of development policies and decision-making that exists in China, a level of credibility. And I'm emphasizing this because we live in a world when credibility is not necessarily present in the right measure with all the critical decision-makers in the world. But credibility is there with Chinese decision-making, and we have to appreciate that. And therefore, when we talk today about the Sustainable Development Goal, the vision that UN has adopted by consensus in 2015, a projection of global development towards 2030, we realize how important the nexus between global development and that of China is. Now, of course, we now also understand how important this vision is for China, because at the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China, which took place a few months ago, we have been able to hear very important projections of development of China for the future. Kevin Rudd, one of the former Prime Minister of Australia and one of the people who know China extremely well, wrote in an article recently that, and I quote, China, breaking with 3,000 years of dynastic history, has turned decisively outward, so that few corners of the world are untouched by its influence. and then Belt and Road Initiative is the center of this new orientation. When it comes to the question of what actually is the basis for that orientation, one cannot ignore something very fundamental which comes from every writing about China today. And that is the talk about the new era, something that is defined in the political language of China as a new era emerging. Now, obviously, in China, the talk is about the socialism with Chinese character for the new era. So it's a complex description. When a group of former presidents met President Xi Jinping in late November last year, we, of course, were curious. And we asked Mr. President, what exactly do you mean by new era? And it was interesting that his reaction to this question was, well, this is actually the most important question before us, before the Communist Party of China and before the government and the state of China. We have, and of course this is not new, President Xi Jinping said that also in his speech at the 19th Congress, we are facing the unbalanced and inadequate development and uneven development and people's ever-growing needs for a better life. Ever-growing needs. Now, a responsible leader like President Xi is intensely aware that the growing needs and ever more diverse needs of the people present a variety of new challenges for the country. And of course, that creates a very big task and big responsibility for the leadership. So I believe that this understanding and the central importance or central place of the concept of the new era has to be appreciated, has to be thought about when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as well. The tasks before China obviously are very important, very large, and they include such things as moving industry up the value chain from projects to brands, cutting overcapacity, promoting entrepreneurship, including development of small and medium-sized enterprises, encouraging innovation, improving environment, addressing the needs of the aging population and the needs of the younger population. So the tasks are really very large, and all this belongs to the talk and the policies of the new era. And of course, in that policy formulation, there will be a need to balance and possibly redefine the relationship between the state and the market, the state and the civil society. So the future may not necessarily look exactly as the continuation of the past. And I believe that from everything that I read about China, everything I hear from friends in China, and everything what we heard from President Xi, that understanding is really not only present but understood as central. And of course, we outside observers rely on the existing credibility of Chinese policymakers that have gained in the past 3 decades very high levels not only of self-confidence but also of practical skills and the understanding of responsibilities that allow a strong and courageous movement forward. So I think that all this would allow a kind of a optimistic hypothesis about China. And I think that this is something we have to discuss here in the West as well. The West obviously is inclined to take a skeptical view vis-à-vis any new phenomenon. That skepticism is a kind of inherent part of Western thought. But at the same time, we have to see the actual potential, the actual power that exists to make further transformations reality. And my hypothesis, therefore, is that the new era is starting with a very good basis and a very good potential for that to be another step forward, a very large step forward, which will transform China and which will transform the world. But of course, all this will happen in a global context. All this is going to happen in the context of a changing global environment. And I think that it is quite important to discuss, to think about the nature of those changes in the global environment and how they relate to the expectations regarding the future development of China in the new era and the Belt and Road Initiative in that context. Here I would advance my second hypothesis, and that is that the world has become not only multipolar and pluralistic, the world is multipolar already and pluralistic, but that pluralism has to be defined further. It is not only multipolarity in terms of power, understood in the classical meaning of that word, but it is also a pluralistic global society characterized by plurality of different, powerful, and often competing versions of modernity. We are not talking simply about a certain number of powers generally following the same idea of modernity. We have different ideas of modernity. And if one thinks about the Western world, China, Russia, India, Southeast Asia, one can see a number of variations, number of different types of visions of modernity, which have to be properly appreciated and properly managed, domestically and internationally. I think that this is a kind of a sub-hypothesis. This world of different pluralistic and often competing visions of modernity reinforces certain basic historically established premises of statehood. Sovereignty of states is not an outmoded concept. I think that we in Europe are sometimes too fast in thinking that our experience, especially through the European Union, has made sovereignty practically obsolete. I'm offering a caricature, obviously. It has never been as simple as that, but we have been, in a way, under the impression that sovereignty is something from the past, something that is not going to have a defining role in the future. But in a world characterized by these different versions of modernity, sovereignty is a very important concept. And obviously, these different versions have different understandings of what does it mean to have a legitimate power of state. Legitimacy may not be interpreted everywhere the same way, but it does require everywhere effectiveness, responsibility, and what I would like to add as a lawyer, a growing importance of the rule of law. I would not go beyond that, because I think that if one enters the area of democracy in terms in which we understand the liberal democracy, we would go beyond what is really central in today's pluralistic international society. Liberal democracy has its own problems nowadays. Liberal democracy is not considered by many as the universal, a matter of universal aspiration as it looked at some point in recent history. This is now different. The idea of liberal democracy has been weakened dramatically, and if one wanted to give a very simple answer of what happened in this regard, I would like to quote another prominent Cambridge professor, David Runciman, who is a professor of political science at Cambridge University, who wrote a very interesting book about what he called the confidence trap, explaining that liberal democracies have, in fact, an inbuilt danger of becoming complacent and overconfident, and that over time they tend to neglect the fact that they have to deliver continuously. So what we now have is a situation in which liberal democracies look somewhat tired, somewhat exhausted, no longer a matter of universal aspiration, and therefore in this changing world of different competing concepts of modernity do not represent a kind of a matter of universal aspiration. Now, of course, we have all seen the manifestations of this development in liberal democracies. We have seen how big money changes the concept of elections, how reality show type of politics changes the public perceptions and authority of politics, and how the growth of politics of fear and provincialism undermines the credibility of democratic systems. We have seen all that, and there is a need for serious repair work in this area, which is committed to liberal democracy in order to make liberal democracy a meaningful and possibly, again, a leading idea in a world of pluralistic concepts, versions of modernity for the coming decades, for the coming century. So repair work would be clearly necessary. That would be my second hypothesis about the nature of multipolarity and pluralistic international society today and the role of liberal democracy in this context. Then obviously multipolarity means, as it always has, also power in the most fundamental meaning of the word. And there again, we have to address, I mean the intellectual community has to deal with this question, the question of how does the management of multipolar world today, in the circumstances that I tried to outline by way of hypothesis, how should that look when it comes to the more fundamental, basic elements of power, power in the sense of military, economic might, and geopolitical clout. Here, I would like to refer to a work which has been quoted often in recent times, a work by an American professor, an American theorist of political science, Graham Allison, who wrote a book about the Thucydides trap. He essentially says that today, in today's world, when we talk about the world in terms of the fundamental meaning of power, we have an established power, United States of America, and the rising power, China. And that situation is not so unknown, that this kind of situations have emerged in the history, and of course there has been a lot of discussion about that. Now, the theory that he advanced is that, in fact, the situation is similar to that of the Peloponnesian War, when Sparta, as the established power at that time, went to war against Athens as the rising power of that time. Now, he addresses that, he names that situation as Thucydides trap, after the historian Thucydides, who wrote a wonderful book about the history of Peloponnesian War. Of course, Professor Ellison is very clear. He says that everybody, the world, has the moral obligation to steer away from Thucydides trap. Now, what I would like to add is that obviously the world has to be intensely aware of the dangers that come with this kind of changing relations in global power structure. But then, if one reads Thucydides, one can find important answers in his writing, in his book itself. It is true that Thucydides, in Book 1 of Peloponnesian War, in paragraph 23, described the cause of war as a result of the fear of Sparta from the growing power of Athens, which led to war. And of course, that is the Thucydides trap. But he also saw no inevitability in this process. He didn't think that this was an inevitable, that this must have happened. He actually describes very good arguments against war in such circumstances. He, in his, again, in his book 1, in paragraph 78 to 85, gave a record of the words of Archidamus, the king of Sparta, who was intensely against the war, but he was outvoted by the assembly of Spartans. Now, I'm mentioning this almost in passing, but it's a fascinating example of how, in fact, a historic experience, a very real one, and a cause for very real concern, does have answers, and some of those answers can be found in fairly ancient history. Now, obviously, one could discuss this much further, but I would like to move on to my next hypothesis, and that is that given this moving, changing picture of global power structure, China has offered some interesting and potentially very important ideas. China proposed, and I quote, a new type of relations among great powers, and to work for, and again I quote, win-win outcomes, And of course, this kind of language has to be taken seriously, in my opinion. In the West, again, in our spirit of skepticism and doubt, we would tend to think, well, you know, this kind of language is usually a cover for a much more selfish interest. People say nice things, but in fact, they mean, well, our power has to grow. This may be a good analytical thing to do, but I think that it is important to understand also what one hears in China, that in fact, commitment to this kind of concepts, win-win outcomes, new type of relations among great power, and global community of shared future, another term which is found in these discussions in China, all this has to be taken seriously. So my hypothesis here would be, let us not overdo the necessary skepticism. Let us be skeptical. Of course, it's necessary to be skeptical, but let us test these ideas against the practical situations as they arise. Here I would like to mention just an interesting terminological nuance that I have discussed with some of my Chinese friends who said, well, you know, in the in the early translations of these concepts, we did not talk about the shared future of the world, we talked about the shared destiny of the world. And then we decided that for the purposes of our international discussion in English, we shall talk about shared future rather than about shared destiny. We want absolutely to avoid any sort of deterministic interpretation. We want to say future is something that we build together. It is not a given. And in order to understand that, you have to understand that you are invited to work with us for such a shared future. Again, one can say, well, these are nice words and they cover a much more selfish look at things. But I, again, will come back to my basic premise, and that is, well, let they be tested against the reality as it evolves. Now, this brings me back to the question of Belt and Road. We have to understand the global reality is going to be complex and changing, and that, in fact, we are likely to see a kind of a moving architecture of the global cooperation, an architecture of multiple overlapping frameworks. It's not going to be a simple structure, a binary structure such as the one that we knew in the Cold War. It is also not going to be something that is defined in advance, but something that has to be created together. And therefore, in that context, the work on Belt and Road Initiative could be a very important, perhaps even central element in the whole the design of the future. Now, we have to understand this development is going to take place at various levels, and in my opinion, it is not likely to be reflected primarily at the level of global relations. It is not likely to be reflected in something like a reform of the United Nations or reform of the International Monetary Fund or some kind of a grand designs of the main powers of our world. And this is precisely the beauty of Belt and Road Initiative, because it allows change to happen at lower levels, change to happen at the level of regional relations, and through a cumulative accumulation of changes at the regional levels, we can perhaps see in the decades to come a global change of serious proportions. This is why I would like to make a few final comments based on 3 different regions where we have seen the application of the idea of Belt and Road so far. I mean, it's a fairly new concept. I mean, it's about 3 or 4 years old, and one shouldn't expect definitive results immediately, but one can see things changing in the regional context. One of these changes relates to Southeast Asia. Now, there are many aspects, and Southeast Asia has traditionally been a very diverse place, a place of different nations, different cultures, a place which has not been easy to organize. It's not a monolithic place, and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a good example of that. But we have seen how certain new developments transformed the place. I would like to mention in particular the development on the Mekong River. Now, Mekong River is, of course, very important for Southeast Asia and important for Asia more generally. There are 6 riparian countries, and this river is essential for survival of about 60 million people who depend for livelihood on the river. Moreover, the hydropower development is very high on the agenda in the riparian countries. There are 11 power plants built along the mainstream and more than 80 on the tributaries to Mekong. And navigation obviously continues to be an important factor of the use of the river. Now, of course, there is history in management of Mekong, and in that history, the Mekong River Commission, which brings together the riparian countries, was essentially moving slowly. And China was not particularly active in that context. It was not part of the Mekong River Commission. It was working with various countries on a project basis. And all that has changed in 2014, roughly at the time of the beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that change is already being felt. The 6 riparian countries have started to work together. The most recent example of that was the meeting of the prime ministers of the Mekong River countries in Phnom Penh about 2 weeks ago. They have adopted a strategically defined plan of cooperation, a 5-year plan of modernization along the river, and defined that plan as an instrument of building a community with a shared future in the Mekong River area. I would like to, again, in the spirit of offering hypotheses, suggest a hypothesis here. Say, let us look at how the Mekong cooperation develops in the future. Let us see to what extent that renewed energy in cooperation along Mekong will transform Southeast Asia, and what kind of lessons will be brought to the rest of Asia, because such situations exist. The need for regional cooperation along major rivers exists elsewhere, and some of them, of course, involve China quite directly, Brahmaputra, and then rivers in the north, and so on. So my hypothesis here is, well, let us think about transformative potential of Belt and Road in a variety of ways, and let us understand that this is going to have an impact at the regional level first and foremost, and let us focus on Southeast Asia as a good example. My second example relates to Central Asian countries, the essentially 5 countries of Central Asia, former Soviet republics. Time doesn't permit me to go into any detail here, but what I would like to say is this. Recently, we have seen some positive indigenous developments in the Central Asian space. Especially the change of leadership in Uzbekistan has created a new political climate. The leaders of the 5 countries started to meet, and there is more and more talk about making Central Asia a place of stronger development, a place where major players of the region, including obviously China, Russia, and European Union, should grow. This is, of course, an interesting situation in which opportunities are growing very fast. I was in Astana in early November this year and discussed these questions with various academics and political leaders from the region, and it is interesting how far and how fast the ambitions in Central Asia are growing. And I would like to suggest a small sub-hypothesis, a test sub-hypothesis. Let us see in 5 years from now whether Astana will become a financial center of Central Asia comparable to something that we have seen in Dubai. Now, we are meeting at Cambridge, and obviously Cambridge is in the United Kingdom, and the UK law is proposed to be the applicable law in the emerging financial center of Astana. Let's see what happens there and what kind of opportunities that would create. Now, obviously, the area is not very well developed in terms of sophistication of economic cooperation. There are still many things that have to be done in terms of avoiding unnecessary obstacles to trade. There are still some very fundamental questions of tariffs, quotas, and other fundamentals of economic operations to be resolved. There was a study of Chongyang Institute, so to speak, my institute, last year, and it has very clearly identified some of these problems, and they have to be addressed clearly. But the political momentum is there, and this is likely to have a transformative effects in the years to come. So my sub-hypothesis relating to Central Asia would be, let us look at Astana and see if Astana becomes a financial center for Central Asia, again, based on models similar to that of Dubai and using English law, common law, as the law of transactions. And finally, a few words about Central and Eastern Europe. Again, something that has been very much in discussion in the past years. As you probably know, China cooperates with 16 countries of Central and Eastern Europe in a format called 16+1. And there are regular meetings, there are certain projects that are slowly evolving, and that form of cooperation has created a great deal of interest and excitement in Central and Eastern Europe. I can say this because from Slovenia, we, as a member of the European country, member of the European Union, we are looking at this cooperation with expectations, so are others. And what we find interesting in that format is that this is one of the few formats in which countries that belong to European Union and non-European Union countries come together and work on projects that bind them. Now in Europe that is important because Europe until recently has been rather bitterly divided and there is a need to overcome those divisions. The interesting thing, and another hypothesis which I would offer for your reflection, is that China can actually play a useful, a positive role in overcoming those divisions, divisions which are no longer defined in political terms alone, but rather in the different levels of development. So there is a need for an increased investment in infrastructure, industrial production, logistics, and other things in Central and Eastern Europe. And obviously, people sometimes view this development as, well, China is penetrating in Europe, and this is a problem. Now, my hypothesis would be much more optimistic. I would say, well, look, let us bring the power that the economy of China already provides into that space and see how best we can work together for a better future, for common future. I would like to quote only one example which is very recent and very practical, and that is the example of the port of Piraeus in Greece. Now that port has been taken over by COSCO, the Chinese state-owned company on shipping and logistics. The transaction has been completed in 2016 by COSCO. I have talked to several friends in Greece who are very positive about this experience. And as a result of that change in the structure of ownership, the total amount of loading and unloading in Piraeus port has already increased by 12.1%, the amount of cargo which is being loaded and unloaded in the port. And there is more to come. The studies which were made last year suggest that the COSCO's investment in Piraeus will boost Greek GDP, the total gross domestic product of Greece, by 0.8%, and create about 31,000 new jobs between the years 2016 and 2025. Now, this is an economic analysis by economists, which I'm not, so I take this as an example of positive expectations, something that goes in the same direction as my otherwise positive and optimistic hypothesis, which I am putting before you today. And I believe that this is really an interesting example which should be looked at seriously. because it doesn't concern only the port of Piraeus and not only the country of Greece, but it also has an impact on the infrastructure further north, to Macedonia, Serbia, and Hungary. In other words, two countries, members of European Union, and 2 aspirant countries for European Union. And if they can all benefit from an increased economic development, that would only be beneficial to everybody, including the European Union as a whole. So again, my hypothesis here would be an optimistic one. And for the very end of my talk, I would like to mention something more symbolic. China has been present in Europe also recently with building bridges. There was a bridge built near Belgrade. There was another one in Narvik, in Norway. And it is expected that China will build a bridge in Croatia, in the peninsula of Pelješac, in the southern part of Croatia. Now, bridge building is an interesting business. It's an interesting experience, but of course, is a great metaphor. Building bridges is an important metaphor in politics, especially international politics, and there can never be a surplus of bridges. But then, in bridge building, one must observe technical standards. Without that, bridges would not function. There has to be a good choice of location. Again, something that has to be very carefully thought through. A choice of material and sophisticated engineering. Well, let us try to think about these things. Technical standards, choice of location, choice of material, and sophisticated engineering, and try to translate these concepts into politics. If we succeed, then obviously the world will be better. Then we will be able to talk about our common future in a very realistic sense. I hope that that will be possible. And as you have noticed, my hypotheses have generally been optimistic, but I know we are meeting in an academic environment, and in the academia, every optimistic hypothesis has to be tested. Therefore, I would welcome your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk, fascinating, thought-provoking. It was very kind of you to pay tribute to bridges at the end in a town named after its bridge. So yes. Thank you for that. We do have time for questions. We have a microphone that will come around. While people are getting their hands ready, and Luis can perhaps go to the person at the back there, can I just ask you one question?
Please.
You mentioned Peter Frankopan at the beginning of your talk, after whom this hall is named, who wrote a fantastic book about the Silk Road. And he gave a talk here last term, the inaugural Lisa Jardine lecture. He said a lot of very interesting things. One thing which struck me about it was when he talked about how Venice had been the leading city in the world. It dominated everything. And it's now mostly remembered as a fun place to go and see what they used to be. And in the meantime, there was a period where people who were newly successful would go there to enjoy the past. He said perhaps the same thing is happening to London and other areas in Western Europe. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Well, there is certainly a threat in that. A threat in the sense that Europe can become a big museum if it is not adequately engaged in the changing world. I think that that's a real possibility, and I have heard that metaphor, if you will, by other authors in the past, saying, well, you know, Europe can become a big Venice, a place with great history, but with very little to offer new today. So I think that possibility is there. Well, you know, my own view is obviously different. I'm trying to use this or abuse this opportunity that you gave me to offer you an optimistic hypothesis. And let me offer you one relating to your specific question. Now, Europe has obviously huge potential. Europe has huge material potential. It has huge intellectual potential, financial, in every respect. Europe is a very strong place, provided that it mobilizes its powers properly. And perhaps engaging with China would be one way of doing it. As we speak, there is a big discussion between European Union and China on the traffic infrastructure, the so-called TENS, the traffic infrastructure. And connectivity is something that even the skeptics in Brussels are willing to accept as a very important platform for the future. Well, let us develop this into its full potential. So I think that, you know, there is scope for making Europe really a very creative, imaginative, and dynamic partner. But we have to go beyond what Europe has been so far. We have to be open-minded, and we have to use that potential more creatively.
Okay, up at the back there.
Dr. Turk, my name is Kevin McCarthy. I'm a student at the Judge Business School and just wanted to thank you for coming and speaking to us today. So I do want to question your optimistic hypothesis a little bit. So, you know, I appreciate that you seem to look at China, and maybe I'm sort of misunderstanding you, as if the West's skepticism about China and their intentions is unwarranted. And, you know, I would just say that, you know, you look at China and the way it's developed in the last sort of 10 to 20 years, and also, you know, how they sort of have dealt with the rule of law. So, I mean, just to offer a couple examples, forcing United States companies and other multinational companies to transfer technologies to Chinese companies, and then basically forcing out those foreign companies from the Chinese market. You know, ignoring the agreement made with the British over Hong Kong, and with sort of the political rules that are supposed to exist in Hong Kong currently. The Spratlys in the Paracel Islands and the 9-Dash Line, which violates UN Commission. And so I'm just sort of wondering that it seems from your perspective that the West's cynicism is unwarranted, but when you look at Chinese history, don't you think that to a degree the West should distrust Chinese motives?
Yeah. No, I think that motives have to be tested, and I hope that I have been sufficiently clear earlier when I said, look, this is an optimistic hypothesis. It has to be tested against the reality as it evolves. And I would like to mention just one example which I think can illustrate what I mean. If we talk about South China Sea, which you kind of alluded to, I would like to say, well, you know, we understand that there is a problem, there is tension, but we also have to appreciate the fact that there are efforts to develop a code of conduct for navigation in South China Sea and a code of conduct on encounters in the sea. I mean, all this is being discussed within ASEAN and between ASEAN and China and individual members of ASEAN and China. I would like that process to be given a chance and to be appreciated in its full meaning. So I think that when one sees tensions rising, one also has to see the beginnings of an answer or the beginnings of a solution to the problems that rise as a result of such tensions. And I believe that in every specific area where tensions arise, and tensions do arise, if for nothing else, then the sheer growth of China brings that to the fore. Therefore, one has to look into the specifics of each of these situations and find answers to the question, all right, how can that be managed? I know that when it comes to South China Sea, you would find strategists who would say, well, this looks very much like the beginning of something that would almost inevitably end in a large military conflict. But there are others who would say, well, it's not so sure, because there are quite a number of players, fairly powerful players, with a variety of agendas, which may end up in something else than military conflict. Let us not forget that if one takes the combined power of everybody involved in South China Sea, including in its own way Japan and Australia and others, then you get a kind of a balance which actually can be part of the solution. So you have a balance of power possible, and you have technical, or let's say more technical visions, such as those codes of conduct, which can be a practical way out of this problem. Therefore, my hypothesis would still be optimistic, because I see at both levels, at the level of balance of power and at the level of technical arrangements that are possible, as solutions to the problem. And I believe that if one looks in every situation, whichever part of the picture you take, you would find a possibility to give answers. So that is justification of my optimism. But again, I'm not claiming that I know what the future will be like. I'm just saying there is no inevitability in sliding into huge tensions and wars. There is no inevitability. There is every reason to work against that. Of course, I could say something about Korea if that's interesting, but this was not your question.
And so we have time for other questions. Yes.
I'd like you to pursue this question of pluralism.
Sorry?
So do you want to take the microphone?
The idea of a more a multipolar world, I think we're all familiar with, but you introduced the notion of pluralism,
yeah.
And you said you thought that would be a growing importance of the rule of law, but we should not go beyond that to suggest that liberal democracy is a universal value.
Yes.
You rather jumped over a question which you mentioned as being associated with in the introduction, namely human rights.
Yeah.
Now, you and I were brought together by the United Nations,
sure.
And by the notion that there are such things as universal values.
Sure.
So I just wonder how far you think this pluralism will go, and whether the idea of universal values and universal human rights is going to be valid in this new century.
Well, I'm glad that this question was raised, and I must say I expected Edward to raise it, because we did have many discussions about that, and I remember we once even were working very hard on a speech by Kofi Annan on universal values, obviously in an effort to provide a platform that would give an answer to this. Now, obviously, I am looking at my experience since mid-70s. I'm old enough to have that experience. I'm not suggesting that in itself defines the kind of convincing answers, but I believe that the golden era of human rights, where human rights were really driving positive changes in the world, were somewhere between 1975, mid-1970s. That was, among other things, also expressed in the American administration of Jimmy Carter and everything that happened, the big transformations in Latin America, first military dictatorships which were gradually replaced by democratic human rights abiding regimes, by changes in East Europe, the advent of Gorbachev, perestroika, collapse of Soviet Union, big transformation in Europe, and then also, of course, the ending of apartheid in Southern Africa. So there was a period of time when human rights were really driving positive change. Now, as I look at the subsequent history, I don't see this happening. I think that we are seeing a kind of slowing down or diminishing transformative power of the idea of human rights. That is why I am more cautious today to talk about the human rights as a transformative element in these changes that one can expect. I can, following the developments in different parts of the world, see, of course, a case for sovereignty as effectiveness, sovereignty as responsible governance. That clearly is there. I would even say the rule of law in certain ways. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting rule by law alone, not law as only an instrument of governance, but also law as a criterion which the power of the state respects, abides by, works about on its basis and so forth. So I see that. I see that in my many discussions with friends in China. But human rights as an idea is not central to that transformation. Now, I do hope that the transformation that is likely to happen will improve human rights situations. And let us not forget, human rights are also economic, social, and cultural rights, which have been neglected in the past, but have to be given more centrality in the future. So human rights is clearly part of the agenda, but I don't see its centrality at this stage. That would be my humble interpretation at this moment. Of course, if you find an argument that would defeat my opinion and show that human rights has that potential and has that power of transforming societies now, I would be only happy, but currently I don't see it.
Right, the next question is at the front there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turk. I really appreciate your talk. As you mentioned in your talk, China should be careful about some contents like a new win-win outcome or a shared destiny. I really agree with you because indeed it is one of the factors that bring the suspicion of Chinese hidden strategy behind this, behind One Belt and One Road. So I want to ask you, in your opinion, what could be a more appropriate way to explain Chinese ideas about the Belt and Road to the Western countries and the world? Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to come back to my basic idea, that is that this concept, Belt and Road Initiative, will be tested in specific geographic circumstances of different regions. And of course, the experience is not going to be exactly the same in every region. Again, one can ask, well, what are the general requirements for such an ambitious vision to succeed? What are general requirements? I would say, well, in general, the vision of Belt and Road Initiative can succeed if it is sufficiently demand-driven. In other words, that it responds to the actual demand in the region where it is applied. And I try to explain this in these three areas in which I can talk a little bit about the changes that are already happening. And the other thing is cultural sensitivity, the need to engage people of those regions in a way which is sufficiently culturally sensitive. And that applies to every region which I mentioned. In the Mekong River, for example, I mean, of course, the questions of environment will be very important. And there are already discussions as to whether the vision of common future of the Mekong area is sufficiently sensitive to the environmental needs, or would that be kind of taken over by economic and energy-based and other elements of policy making? So, I mean, there is going to be a debate in every regional situation, and that debate will be different from one region to another. But I think that if you want me to say, okay, what are the test questions that would show that this is genuine, I would say, yes, we have to ask ourselves, are the projects that constitute Belt and Road Initiative concretely demand-driven? Is there real demand for them? If the answer is yes, okay, then we are in the area where we can talk about win-win, we can talk about working out common future. If not, then we are somewhere else. And also cultural sensitivity. That is something that has to be very seriously taken into account in every development project.
We really are, I'm afraid, running out of time. If there's a very brief question, we can take a very brief question, then we will have to finish. So right at the back there.
Very good question. Do you think that the Western superpowers, and more specifically perhaps the United States, is prepared to give up the world leadership to China in the next, say, 10, 15 years?
Yeah. Well, the answer is no. And the second part, the continuation of the answer, is that this is not even asked for. I think that China has been really quite careful not to project itself as a kind of simple competitor for global hegemony, if I put it in a slightly caricatured manner. I mean, of course, this whole approach to the growth of importance of China has been much more about win-win, new type of relations, responsibility, step by step, all kinds of things which diminish the fear that there is a claim or a need or an interest to replace one hegemon by another. I mean, again, this is a caricature, but you asked in a your question was put in very stark terms. So I I think I have the liberty of answering in rather stark terms. So the answer would be no, and I don't think that this is really the name of the game. I tried to hint to that by saying, look, there will be multiple and very different formats, form of cooperation developing. Competition will be there, of course. Competition is a good thing. Competition brings opportunities. And of course, sometimes competition may look like, quest for replacing one hegemon by another hegemon. Although I don't consider the United States to be in a purely hegemonic situation. It also depends on others. It depends on China. It depends on other actors everywhere in the world. Therefore, I believe that one has to prepare for a variable geometry, one where binary sort of zero-sum game type of logic will not help us. We have to be much more nuanced and much more open to understanding of all the factors that influence a particular situation, and do not believe that we are heading towards a new type of binary Cold War type of relationship in the future, the one that we have seen in the time of Soviet-American rivalry. I think that the future will be different. So that's an attempt to give you an answer. Again, we are in an academic environment, so all this is legitimate. And I hope I gave you enough of provocative, optimistic, and some may say perhaps even slightly naive points of departure for your thought. But you are critical people, and you will be able to figure out answers with much more precision in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Turk. Great. Fascinating.